Okay, welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be talking about where the books for young men are. Where those YA books for young boys, young men, teenage year readers, as we like to call them. So there was a video that resurfaced that was uploaded like 5 years ago. It was an interview with the author of the Suneater series, Christopher Rocchio, and in the video, Rocchio made some comments about how there were no books for, young men. That a lot of the books nowadays are books that are, either some kind of female led main character book, and that there are no books for young men, so he doesn't know what to recommend to people.
I've not seen a YA fantasy novel in years now that's not about a rebellious princess.
Right, exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
I got in trouble because I was asking for he's basically my nephew, but my cousin. I was like, "Do we have any YA books for boys?" And this lady on Twitter was upset with me, and like, I literally cannot find one that's not Rick Riordan, and he's read all of those.
Out of all the things he said, I wanted to structure this video around that particular comment that he made in the interview, where he was, basically talking about how there's no books for young men nowadays, and that mm, a lot of the books nowadays aren't for young men. And I have to disagree and agree at the same time. I think that there's a lot to unpack here. So we're going to be looking at, what is a book for a boy or, a guy? What is a book for a guy? Are there any books for guys for young men nowadays? Are there any specifically? Are there any YA books for young men? Nowadays or within the last 10 years, and if that really matters. So what exactly are books for young men? Well, from Rocchio's comment in the interview, you would assume that he's alluding to books for young men are basically the antithesis of the books that he was talking about that are popular nowadays. Books that are for young women, or books with a female-led main character or a female main character. And I don't know if I agree with that. I think that there's this notion that the books that are targeted towards a certain audience are for that certain audience. And that's not something that I think is actually, there are books that are targeted for women, for young women. But I think that just because a book has a female lead doesn't mean that that book is for women only, or that book is, only a book for women. I think that book can be at the same time for men. It just depends on what is being talked about in the book that can really sway the taste to, the majority of, one gender or the other. Might sound cliche. I think at the end of the day, any book can be for anybody. As long as you like what the book is talking about, then the book can be for, a woman, a guy, girl, they, them. It doesn't really matter who the book is for. I think it matters more so if the reader enjoys what the book is talking about. There are books with female main characters that I love that I started reading from, young age. One of my favorite books from when I was younger was this series, Shamer's Chronicles. No, but the first book in the series is Shamer's Daughter, which revolves around a young girl who gets this power to make people confess their deep, dark secrets. And she gets this power from her mother. And the story basically revolves around what her life in the world is like now, and a lot of stuff that her family goes through because of these powers that her and her mother have. And that was one of my favorite series at the time for a multitude of reasons. I think mainly it was one of my favorite series because of how connected I felt to the main character. Because some of the things that she was going through in the book, I really felt in my life too. So just because there is a book with a female main character, that doesn't really mean that this book is for a specific gender. Now, I think there is a clear distinction that we can make, that there are books where you feel represented in the characters and the cast of characters that are in the book and the things those characters are doing. But I think that there is we need to make a distinction between representation in a book and a book being for a certain audience. I think a book can be for anybody, but I think that the representation in a book can be for a specific demographic. And I feel like there's this notion that a lot of books that I grew up reading, not from when I was younger, are kind of being wiped out. And these are the books that have, that center around a young boy who is most likely white. And, he has the female love interest and, the male best friend or whatever. And sometimes we'll have a black best friend wiped out. I wouldn't say that they're being wiped out. I would say that there's been an increase in representation in books for other demographics. And so I feel like there are some people that feel as if I don't see myself in this book, then I can't read it, or the book is not for me, which I understand to a point, but that isn't always true. I definitely think that there are books that people can feel as if that, you know, they are not the targeted demographic. But I feel like there's a lot of books that I grew up reading where I felt like I wasn't exactly the targeted demographic. I was definitely the targeted demographic for some books because I was, a guy, but I wasn't the targeted demographic as in I didn't see myself in a lot of these characters that I read growing up. Books like Harry Potter or Aragon, I didn't really see books that represented me, but I still, thought those books were for me because of how I connected with the story. And I think maybe there is this, there's the rise in representation for people of other demographics, whether, there are women, people of color, that there are books now with those demographics in it, but the main demographic of how books used to be for, men, white men, they don't really see themselves in those books anymore. And so because books, represented them most of the time beforehand, but now that, things are changing and there's a lot more representation, they're less likely to read the books that, have they're less likely to read the books that represent a specific demographic, whether it be a book about, African characters in a fantasy world, or a book about, a girl in a fantasy world, or a woman of color in a fantasy world or a science fiction world. Yeah, I can't help you there. I think that's something for a lot of other people to get over and just open their mind to read other things that don't represent them. I think at the end of the day, we consume stories not only because that we like to see ourselves represented. Yes, we like to see ourselves represented in stories, but I think stories help you connect to those demographics or groups that you're not a part of, and you get to see the world and see things from the eyes of a person of that group. And so if you're only reading stories to see where you are represented, maybe it's time to pick up another book, right? I don't really think that there are books for boys. I think that I think almost any book is for a boy, right? If we're talking about and asking the question, where are the books or what happened to the books that had male, main characters, I think that I would have to agree with that sentiment that there has been a decrease in books with male main characters. In the 2000s or around the 2000s, I was barely cognizant at the time, there was a, really large gap in, want for books with female main characters. People wanted to see books with female main characters and stories centered around women. I think as time went on, we got stories like Hunger Games, stories like Twilight. We got stories like The Natural History of Dragons, the Lady Trent series, and a lot more. And so throughout like the 2010s and so, there was this kind of bubbling up of stories where they featured women as the main characters in a fantasy setting or science fiction setting. And as their, this little bubble of female led stories was bubbling up, we finally got to, I think, the point where it burst. Yeah, around 2020, and especially when TikTok took over. With the introduction of TikTok and especially BookTok, there were a lot of stories and books that blew up because of people wanting to read, and specifically, there's one specific subgenre that really took everybody by storm, and people just started picking up tons and tons of books. Romantasy. Romantasy, really took the world by storm, or has been taking the world by storm for a long time now, but people are really, really seeing it come to the forefront of books, especially when you look at some of the, top 10 lists that we have on different book websites. And so with the rise of romantasy, we see people, start picking up books like Sarah J. Maas, who has been writing romantasy for a while with her A Court of Thorns and Roses and Throne of Glass series and Crescent City and so on and so forth. And we see people really getting into books like Fourth Wing and Rachel Gillig. But at the same time, while romantasy, is blowing up and all these stories with female-led characters in a romantasy setting are taking the world by storm, fantasy has also, just standard regular fantasy, whatever you would call regular fantasy, has also been, increasing the amount of female-led stories that we've got stories like Legendborn, Children of Blood and Bone, Skyward, and so many more. And some of these books I would classify as being YA books with female-led characters, but they're not strictly romantasy series. And with that, we've come to a point where we see that there are books that are catered towards women, and most of the popular books that you will see on maybe somebody's top 10 list, or you would see on Goodreads as like one of the recommended books, recommended fantasy or recommended romantasy books, you would see books that have or feature a female main character. Is it to say that there's been a decrease in the amount of male main character books that have been put out by fantasy or science fiction? I can't say because I don't have the actual, point by point data to point to that, because searching for this data is so hard online. What I can say is that romantasy books are at the forefront of books that people think of when they probably think about fantasy nowadays. If you tell somebody that, yeah, I got this book it's a fantasy book that I got off of TikTok, they might assume that it's a romantasy book because those are the popular books that are being recommended nowadays. So what I'm leaning towards is that there has probably been a trade-off in the amount of books or the amount of visibility books with male main characters for fantasy books or science fiction books are getting, because romantasy is just dominating the genre right now. I don't think there's been a decrease in the books that are for young men. I think that there's actually been an increase in those books. Books that I said before, like Legendborn or Children of Blood and Bone, Skyward, and there's other books as well, like Six of Crows, I think is one of the books that are specifically for can be for male audiences, young men audiences. You also have Scythe, you have Red Rising. All these books are popular books in the genres nowadays that I think young men would take an interest to, regardless if the main character of the book is, female, male, non-binary, whoever. So I definitely think that there's a decrease in the books for male main characters. I think that the books for, young men, young people in general, has been an increase. And if they're not interested in romantasy, there's a plethora of books for them to read that don't center around, things that they aren't interested in. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you guys think that there's definitely a, decreased discrepancy in books for young men? And also let me know in the comments if you have an inkling or you have a reason why that books with male main characters have just decreased a lot in the last, I don't know, 15 or 10 years. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will catch you guys next time with another video. See you later. Peace.